honestly, even now, years later, this is still one of the creepiest situations I have ever been in. It's one of those memories that never really fades, no matter how much time passes. It doesn't come back as a clear picture either. It comes back as a feeling, that same tightness in the chest, that same cold realization that something could have gone very, very wrong. I was about 15 or 16 at the time, old enough to feel responsible, but young enough to still trust people more than I should have. I used to babysit for a family who lived in an apartment complex not far from my house. They had 2 young kids, both toddlers, full of energy and always wanting to be outside. I babysat for them regularly, so the apartment and the neighborhood felt familiar to me. Safe, even. The apartment complex was pretty typical. Several low-rise buildings, a shared parking lot in the middle, sidewalks looping around, and a few small patches of grass. Most afternoons, if the weather was nice, I'd take the kids outside so they could ride their bikes around the parking lot or play with chalk. The parents were fine with it, and other kids from the complex were often outside too. It felt normal, routine. One afternoon, while we were outside, one of the neighbors struck up a conversation with me. He was a middle-aged man, someone I'd seen around before but never really spoken to. I didn't know his name, and I don't remember if he ever told me. At the time, he didn't seem threatening, just a neighbor making small talk. And because I was babysitting for his neighbors, I felt like I couldn't just ignore him without seeming rude. So I talked to him. At first, the conversation was harmless enough. He asked me how old I was, what school I went to, if I liked it. He asked if I was into sports. Then he got more specific. He asked if I was a runner. I remember laughing awkwardly and saying, no, not really. That's when he said it. He told me I had amazing legs. Even as I write that now, my skin crawls. Looking back, that comment alone should have been enough to set off every alarm in my head. A grown man commenting on the body of a teenage girl. But at that age, I was already painfully used to being objectified by older men. It shouldn't have been normal, but it was. So instead of reacting the way I should have, I brushed it off. I felt uncomfortable, annoyed even, but not afraid. I just wanted the conversation to end. Meanwhile, no, I was trying to keep an eye on 2 toddlers who were riding their bikes in circles, occasionally wobbling and almost crashing into parked cars. My attention was split, and I was tired of standing there, listening to this man talk. Eventually, I told him we were going inside for lunch. He nodded and walked away. I gathered the kids, herded them inside the apartment, and closed the door behind us. And here's the part that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. I didn't lock the door. It wasn't something I consciously chose not to do. I just didn't think about it. We had only been outside for a little while. I was distracted, focused on getting the kids settled and fed. Locking the door didn't even cross my mind. We went into the kitchen and sat down at the table. I started setting out lunch, opening containers, cutting food into smaller pieces. The kids were chatting and making a mess like kids do. Everything felt normal. Then the door opened. At first, I didn't even register it. I assumed one of the parents had come home early, or maybe one of the kids had left it cracked. But then I looked up. He was standing there, the same man from outside. He stepped fully into the apartment, turned around, closed the door behind him, and locked it. That was the exact moment my body went cold. I don't remember every detail of what happened next, but I remember the feeling with terrifying clarity. The sudden awareness that I was alone in an apartment with 2 small children and a grown man who had no reason to be there. The realization that no one else was in the apartment, that the door was locked, that something was very wrong. He smiled. Like nothing about this was strange. He said something along the lines of, wanting to get to know me better. I remember my heart pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. My mind raced, but at the same time, it felt blank. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had to get him out of that apartment, immediately. I didn't know what he wanted, but every instinct I had told me that if he stayed, something terrible could happen. I don't remember exactly what I said to him. I wish I did. Maybe part of my brain blocked it out. I know I tried to stay calm. I know I didn't scream or threaten him. I think I said something about the parents coming home soon, or that he wasn't supposed to be there, or that the kids needed quiet. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that somehow it worked. He hesitated. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he unlocked the door and left. The second he was gone, I locked the door behind him. I stood there shaking, trying to act normal for the kids who, thankfully, seemed completely unaware of how close things had come to going horribly wrong. I sat with them until the parents came home, but I was on edge the entire time. Every sound made me jump. Every second felt stretched thin. When the parents got back, I left like I always did. I smiled, said goodbye, and walked home. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The fear didn't fade once I was out of the apartment. It grew. It twisted into guilt and embarrassment. I kept replaying it in my head, telling myself it was my fault, that if I had just locked the door, none of this would have happened. I felt stupid, ashamed, like I'd failed at something basic. I didn't want to tell anyone, but the feeling wouldn't let me go. By the time I got home, my nerves were shot. So I told my mom. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew this was bigger than my embarrassment. My mom's reaction was immediate and intense. She was furious, terrified, and deeply upset all at once. She didn't question me. She didn't blame me. She didn't brush it off. She knew instantly how serious this was. She called the parents I babysat for. They called the police. That's when we learned the truth. The man who had walked into that apartment locked the door behind him and told me he wanted to get to know me better wasn't just a creepy neighbor. He was wanted by the police for rape. I remember sitting there in shock as the weight of that information sank in. Every detail of the encounter suddenly felt heavier. The comment about my legs, the way he felt comfortable enough to follow us inside, the way he locked the door without hesitation. I realized just how close I had come to something that could have changed my life forever. And not just my life. There were 2 small children in that apartment too. After that, everything changed for me. I became obsessive about locking doors. Even now, years later, I check locks multiple times before I can relax. I don't care how safe a place feels. I don't care how short a moment will be. Doors get locked. I also stopped blaming myself. I was a kid. I was doing my job. I didn't invite him inside. I didn't give him permission to cross that line. He made that choice, not me. But the fear stayed. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about how easily things could have gone differently. What if I hadn't said the right thing? What if he hadn't decided to leave? What if I had frozen completely? That thought still sends a chill through me. Because the scariest part of this story isn't what happened. It's what almost did. I still think about this night more often than I would like to admit. At the time, I didn't realize how deeply it would stick with me, but now, looking back, I understand why it does. It was one of those moments where nothing truly terrible happened, yet everything about it felt wrong. The kind of experience that doesn't end with sirens or headlines, but instead settles quietly into your memory and refuses to leave. I was on a long road trip, driving alone, crossing several states in one stretch. It wasn't a spontaneous trip. I had planned it out, mapped the route, and even told a couple of people where I'd be stopping along the way. Still, long solo drives have a way of blurring together after a while. The highway stretches endlessly ahead of you, mile after mile of the same view, the same hum of tires on asphalt, the same glow of headlights cutting through the dark. By the time this happened, it was already late, around 10 at night. Not incredibly late, but late enough that traffic had thinned out. The sky was completely dark, with only a few distant lights from passing cars and the occasional small-town exit. I had been driving for hours, and even though I wasn't exhausted yet, I could feel that dull mental fog setting in, the kind that tells you it's probably a good idea to stop soon. When I saw the gas station sign ahead, I felt a small sense of relief. I didn't desperately need fuel, but I was low enough that I didn't want to risk pushing it. More than that, I wanted a break, a chance to stretch my legs, use the restroom, maybe grab a drink to stay alert. The gas station was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. It sat just off the highway, with a small convenience store and a few pumps under bright fluorescent lights. Everything around it beyond that little bubble of light was pitch black. No nearby restaurants, no other businesses, just open road and darkness. As I pulled in, I noticed one other car already there. A plain-looking sedan parked at the opposite pump. Nothing flashy or run down. Clean, simple, easy to overlook. At first, I didn't think much of it. Gas stations often have at least one other car, even late at night. I parked at my pump, turned off the engine, and stepped out. That's when I noticed something slightly odd. The man in the other car hadn't gotten out yet. He was just sitting there, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. He didn't glance at me, didn't reach for the door, didn't do anything at all. Again, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was finishing a phone call. Maybe he was just tired and zoning out. People do strange but harmless things all the time, especially late at night on long drives. I went inside the store to pay. The clerk barely looked up, clearly bored and counting down the minutes until their shift ended. The store itself was small, brightly lit, and smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies. I paid quickly, grabbed a bottle of water, and headed back outside. That's when my stomach dropped. The man was no longer sitting in his car. He was standing next to my driver's side door, not near his pump, not between the cars, directly beside my door, close enough that if I reached out, I could have touched him. I froze for half a second, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. He looked normal. Well, that's the part that makes it harder to explain. He wasn't dirty or wild-looking. He didn't appear angry or drunk. His clothes were clean. His posture was relaxed. If I had seen him in any other situation, I probably wouldn't have given him a second thought. But something about the way he was standing there felt wrong, like he had been waiting for me. Before I could even say anything, he spoke. "Long drive, huh?" His voice was calm, casual, friendly, almost. The kind of tone you might use to make small talk with a stranger at a rest stop. I nodded slightly, not trusting my voice yet. Then he kept going. "You take the I-90? That alone wouldn't have been alarming. A lot of people take the same highways, but before I could respond, he continued, talking like he already knew the answer. That stretch after the river is real dark. No lights at all. You should be careful." Every muscle in my body tensed. He described the exact route I was taking. Not just the highway number, but a specific part of it. A stretch I remembered clearly because it had felt especially isolated when I drove through it earlier. I hadn't mentioned my route to anyone at the gas station. I hadn't been talking on the phone. I hadn't said a word. I muttered a quiet thanks, barely louder than a whisper. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't challenge him. I didn't want to escalate anything. I just wanted to get back into my car. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I did it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, loud enough that it almost drowned out everything else. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me through the window. I started the engine, trying to act normal, trying not to show how panicked I felt. I pulled away from the pump slowly, carefully, not wanting to draw attention. As I drove past him, I glanced in the side mirror. He was still standing there, his head turning slightly to follow my car as I left the station. The moment I pulled back onto the highway, the adrenaline really hit. My breathing was shallow. My hands felt numb on the steering wheel. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see his headlights appear behind me. They didn't. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that staying on the route he had described would be a mistake, that whatever reason he had for knowing my path, I didn't want to give him the chance to be right. So I took the next exit. I didn't care where it led. I just needed to get off that stretch of road. I found a different route, one with more lights, more traffic, more places to stop if I needed help. Only after I had been driving for another 20 minutes did my heart rate finally start to slow down. Nothing else happened that night. I made it to my destination safely. No one followed me. No one confronted me again. On paper, it sounds like a minor interaction. A stranger made a comment. I felt uncomfortable. End of story. But it didn't feel minor. What stuck with me wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, how confident he was, how certain, the way he positioned himself by my door instead of staying near his own car, the fact that he waited for me to come back out of the store instead of leaving. I still don't know how he knew my route. And maybe he saw my license plate and guessed where I was headed. Maybe it was a coincidence and he took a lucky shot. Maybe he was just making conversation and didn't mean anything by it at all. But I also know this. The fear I felt was real. There are moments in life where your instincts speak louder than logic, where you don't have evidence or proof, but you know something isn't right. That night was one of those moments for me. Since then, I've been more careful on road trips. I don't linger at quiet gas stations late at night. I pay attention to where people are standing, not just who they are. And if something feels off, I listen to that feeling instead of brushing it aside. Because sometimes the scariest encounters aren't the ones where something terrible happens. I was in a seat near the middle of the room, thinking it would be safer than sitting near a corner or window. My backpack was on the floor by my feet, my notebook open, and my phone face down beside it. I was trying to focus on my studies, but the silence made my thoughts wander more than usual. Every few minutes, someone would walk past the aisle between the shelves, their footsteps soft against the carpet. A librarian pushed a cart of books somewhere in the distance. Everything felt normal, calm, almost boring. That was exactly why I liked studying there. Nothing unexpected ever happened in that place, or at least that's what I believed at the time. After about 20 minutes, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A man pulled out a chair at the far end of my table and sat down. I didn't look at him directly at first. People sat at shared tables all the time, especially when the library started to fill up later in the day. I told myself it was nothing. Still, I felt a small shift in the air, like the room had changed just a little. I glanced up briefly. He was older than most of the students there, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He wore a dark jacket even though it wasn't cold, and his hair looked unwashed, flattened in places like he had been running his hands through it too much. He wasn't carrying any books, no laptop, no bag. He just sat there, and hands resting on the table, looking straight ahead. I went back to my notes, telling myself not to overthink it. Libraries were public spaces. Anyone could come in. Still, something about the way he sat bothered me. He didn't open a book. He didn't check his phone. He didn't even look around the room. It felt like he was waiting. A few minutes passed. I tried to focus on reading, but I could feel his presence like a weight. Then I heard the soft sound of paper sliding across wood. I looked up and saw a small folded note resting near my notebook. My heart jumped. I looked at the man. He was watching me now, his eyes fixed on my face, unblinking. Slowly, I unfolded the note. Inside, written in neat, careful handwriting, were the words, "Are you waiting for someone?" I froze. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe he thought I was someone else. Maybe this was some awkward attempt at starting a conversation. But the way he stared made my skin crawl. I shook my head slightly, trying not to draw attention, and mouthed, "No." I didn't write back. I didn't say anything out loud. I just placed the note back on the table and returned my eyes to my book. For a moment, nothing happened. The room seemed to breathe again. I told myself I was being dramatic. People were weird sometimes. Maybe that was all it was. I tried to read, forcing my eyes to move across the page, but the words stopped making sense. I could feel him watching me, like a pressure between my shoulders. Then, once again, the sound of paper sliding reached my ears. Another note appeared, closer this time. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to read it, but I felt like I had to. With shaking fingers, I unfolded it. Good. That was it. Just one word. I looked up again. He hadn't moved. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. His face was blank, calm, almost satisfied. The fear hit me all at once, sharp and cold. That single word felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't casual. It felt like a statement, like confirmation of something I didn't want to understand. I quickly gathered my things, trying not to panic. I shoved my notebook into my backpack, zipped it halfway, then all the way when my hands fumbled. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I stood up, keeping my movement steady, pretending everything was normal. I didn't look at him again. As I walked away from the table, I expected to hear his chair scrape back, to feel footsteps behind me. But there was nothing. The library remained quiet, unchanged. That somehow made it worse. I walked faster, heading toward the exit, telling myself not to run, not to draw attention. When I reached the glass doors, I pushed them open and stepped outside. The cool air hit my face, and for a second I felt relief. I kept walking toward the parking lot, my car parked near the edge, close to the trees. Then I looked back. He was standing inside the library just beyond the glass, watching me. He hadn't followed me out. He hadn't rushed after me. He just stood there, eyes locked on me as if he knew exactly where I was going. I felt exposed, like an animal being observed. I turned away and walked faster, keys already in my hand. I didn't look back again until I reached my car. When I did, he was still there, still watching, unmoving. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, breathing hard. My hands were shaking so badly I had to rest them on the steering wheel. When I finally looked up again, he was gone. I drove away immediately. I didn't go home. I drove around for almost an hour, checking my mirrors, jumping at every shadow. My phone stayed silent. Nothing else happened that day. But even now, years later, I think about that moment, about that word. Good. I still don't know what he meant, or what would have happened if my answer had been different. And sometimes, when I'm sitting alone in a quiet place, I feel that same pressure on my back, like someone is watching and waiting for confirmation. I was still in high school when this happened. old enough to walk to and from school on my own, but still young enough to feel small in the world. I lived too far out to catch the school bus, so walking was just part of my daily routine. Every morning and every afternoon, I followed the same streets, passed the same houses, and eventually learned which paths saved time and which ones felt safest. There was one alley I usually took as a shortcut. It cut between a couple of houses and let me avoid walking all the way around the block. It wasn't long, just a narrow pass-through, and for the longest time I never felt unsafe there. It was just another part of my route, something familiar and unremarkable. But a few weeks before this happened, something changed. My mom came home one day, shaken. She told me about a man who had stopped her while she was alone. He asked her for directions, which didn't seem strange at first, but then he asked her to get into his car to help him find the street he was looking for. She refused and came home safe, but the story stayed with me. The way she described his persistence, the feeling that something hadn't been right. After that, I stopped using the alley. I took the long way home instead, even though it added extra time to my walk. I didn't like the idea of cutting through a place where no one could see me if something happened. My mom's story played in my head every time I passed near it. Then one day, I was exhausted. School had been draining. I was tired of walking the longer route, and I convinced myself that I was being overly cautious. The alley was short, that nothing had ever happened to me there before. I told myself it would be fine just this once, so I turned into the alley. I had barely stepped inside when I heard a car behind me on the street. I don't know what made me look back, but something in my body told me I needed to. When I turned my head, I saw a van slowing down. Inside was an older man, and he was staring straight at me, not glancing, not checking his mirrors. He was watching me. I felt my stomach twist, but I kept walking, trying to act normal. I told myself not to panic, not to draw attention to myself. Maybe he was just slowing for the turn. Maybe he'd drive past. But the longer I walked, the more I felt it. That heavy feeling in your chest when something is wrong, but you don't want to admit it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to go back the long way, to get somewhere public where people could see me. But I didn't. I didn't want to feel stupid or dramatic. I didn't want to look paranoid. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. Still, the way his eyes followed me made my skin crawl. It felt like he was studying me, deciding something. That was when a thought hit me hard and fast. Get your phone out. Pretend you're on a call. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up to my ear, starting to fake a conversation. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Then another wave of panic hit me. My phone didn't have minutes. I couldn't actually call anyone. If something happened, I had no one on the other end of the line. I kept walking anyway, pretending to talk, forcing my voice to sound casual. That's when I heard the sound of a car coming down the alley behind me. I knew without looking. It was the van. My stomach dropped completely. The sound of the engine felt too loud in the narrow space. The van crept up beside me, slowing to match my pace. I could feel it there, close enough that I didn't even need to turn my head to know how near he was. All I could think about was my mom's story, the man who asked her for directions, the way he tried to lure her into his car, the wrongness of it. And now here I was, living it myself, alone, a kid. The van stopped right next to me. I turned my head slowly and saw him looking me up and down. His eyes flicked to my phone, then back to my face. He asked if I could help him find a street. My mouth felt dry. I told him I didn't know street names. My voice barely sounded like my own. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me. The silence was unbearable. It felt like time stretched out, like everything slowed down. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I felt frozen in place, my body locked up completely. My mind was blank except for one overwhelming thought. This is it. He kept looking at me, at my phone, at me again. It felt like he was weighing something in his head, like he was calculating whether this was worth it. The pros and cons, the risk. Finally, without saying another word, he drove away. The moment the van turned out of the alley, my legs started working again. I ran all the way home without stopping, my heart pounding, my breath burning in my chest. I looked over my shoulder the entire time, terrified he would come back. When I got home, I told my mom everything. I expected comfort. I expected her to understand, especially after what she had gone through herself. She didn't. She accused me of making it up for attention. She said I was copying her story. She told me I was exaggerating. The next day, she had her boyfriend walk me to school, and when nothing happened, she doubled down. She called me a liar, an attention seeker. She had no idea how scared I had been, how real it felt, how close I believed I'd come to something terrible. Years later, after I'd moved away, I started hearing stories, women disappearing, kids taken off the streets in broad daylight, vans, strangers, the same patterns over and over again. And every time, my stomach dropped. I don't doubt for a second that if I hadn't pulled out my phone and made it look like I had a witness, I would have been one of them. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't pretended to make that call. What choice he would have made if he thought no one was listening. No matter how much time passes, thinking about that moment still makes me feel cold. I don't think that feeling will ever really go away. I'm writing this now because this story has lived in my head for years, half-formed and incomplete, like a memory with torn edges. I remember how it started, and I remember how terrified I felt at the end, but there's a stretch in the middle that's just gone. Maybe writing it out is my way of trying to understand it, or maybe it's just my mind's way of finally letting it breathe. After college, I wanted to do something meaningful with my time. I didn't want to just work and go home and repeat the same empty routine. I wanted to help people in a way that actually mattered. That's how I ended up volunteering for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. The training alone was intense. Every Saturday for 2 months, several hours each session, learning how to talk to people who were standing on the edge of the worst moments of their lives. It was emotionally exhausting, but I felt proud to be there. I felt like I was doing something good. Once I started taking calls, it was exactly as hard as everyone warned me it would be. Some nights I'd go home drained, carrying voices and stories that weren't mine, but somehow felt like they were. Still, it was rewarding. You'd get that one call where someone decided to stay, just for one more night, and that made everything feel worth it. The other volunteers were a huge part of why I stuck with it. We leaned on each other, shared advice, comforted each other after rough shifts. My training group became close, and because of that environment, I assumed everyone who volunteered there shared the same values. Compassion, trust, safety, that included Greg. Greg wasn't part of my training group, but we worked a lot of the same shifts. He was in his 50s while I was in my mid-20s. He was well known around the center. People spoke about him like he was a legend. He'd volunteered there for decades. He was a military veteran, a recovering alcoholic, someone who, according to everyone, had saved countless lives just by sharing his story with callers. When people talked about him, it was always with respect. So when Greg asked me if I could dog sit for him one evening, it didn't feel strange. I loved dogs and I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? Everything I knew about him painted him as a good person. He told me he'd be out for the evening and back early the next morning. I'd just need to come by, let the dogs out if needed, keep them company for a few hours and then head home. Simple. He gave me his address. Now, and we agreed I'd come by Friday night to meet the dogs and go over everything. That night, I drove to his neighborhood and parked in front of a completely normal-looking house. 2 stories, neatly kept. Nothing about it stood out. Greg opened the front door with a wide smile, his 2 golden retrievers bouncing happily around his legs. They were sweet, friendly, and immediately made me feel at ease. Dogs have a way of doing that. He showed me around the house where their food was, explained that they'd already been walked twice, so I could just let them into the fenced backyard if they needed to go out. Everything felt straightforward. He was friendly, chatty, exactly how he was at the crisis center. I noticed he was dressed nicer than usual, a shiny collared shirt, clean and pressed. I assumed he was going to some kind of event. As we walked through the house, I started wondering when he was actually going to leave. That's when he asked if I wanted to see the upstairs. The question struck me as a little odd, but not enough to alarm me. I thought maybe he was proud of his home. People get that way sometimes. So I said yes. He led me up the carpeted stairs and down a dim hallway. At the end, he opened a door that had been slightly ajar and stepped inside. "This is my bedroom," he said. I stepped just inside the doorway and my brain struggled to catch up with what I was seeing. The room didn't match the rest of the house at all. The bed was enormous, covered in red velvet with a canopy overhead. Black lace draped the curtains, the pillows, the bedding. Several candles were lit, their flames flickering softly. The whole room felt heavy, intimate, deliberate. Then Greg sat down on the bed. He looked at me and smiled, wiggling his eyebrows like it was some kind of joke we were sharing. I laughed nervously and took a step back. I remember saying something like, "I think you've got the wrong idea." That's when he brought up a comment I'd made at the crisis center, something flirty and stupid I'd said to another volunteer I had a crush on. He'd overheard it and apparently decided it applied to him. He patted the bed beside him. That's when it fully hit me. He genuinely thought this was going somewhere. That because he'd overheard one offhand comment, I was open to whatever this was. I felt sick. I had never flirted with him, never encouraged him. The realization made my skin crawl. I didn't have a clever response. I didn't have a sharp comeback. I froze. I crossed my arms over my chest and shook my head no. His expression changed instantly. The smile dropped. The warmth disappeared. The room felt colder. He stood up abruptly and said he needed to get going. His voice was flat, edged with irritation and something darker. He blew out the candles one by one, muttering under his breath, then moved toward the door. I didn't wait for him. I hurried out of the room and nearly ran down the stairs. Within minutes, he grabbed his keys and left through the garage. As he went, he told me to call him if I had any problems. The house fell silent. The only sound was the dog's nails clicking on the floor as they followed me around. My heart was racing. I wanted to leave immediately, but I also didn't want to abandon the dogs. And with him gone, I did feel a little safer. The next few hours passed quietly. I sat with the dogs, tried to calm myself down, told myself it was over. When it got to be around 8 or 9, I decided it was time to go home. That's when I realized something was wrong. Greg hadn't given me a key. I checked the front door, hoping it was the kind that could lock without a key. It wasn't. Deadbolt. I tried the sliding glass door to the backyard, but there was no way out from there either. My chest tightened with dread. I called Greg. He answered, sounding amused. I told him he'd forgotten to give me a key. I tried to sound light, casual. He laughed and said, "Whoops," like it was nothing. He suggested I try the garage. Then, casually, he said I could just sleep in his bed. I ignored that. I went into the dark garage, turned on the light, and closed the door behind me so the dogs wouldn't get out. I opened the garage door and tried to do that thing where you duck under it as it closes. It didn't work. The door bounced back up, sensing something underneath. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and cold. He knew this would happen. I shut the door and sank to the floor as the dogs scratched and whined. I let them into the garage and hugged them, crying into their fur. I felt trapped, humiliated, terrified, and then nothing. That's where my memory stops. I don't remember calling him back. I don't remember if he returned. I don't remember if I called someone else, or if I finally just left the house unlocked. That entire stretch is blank, like my brain shut down to protect me. Years later, I found out Greg had died suddenly of a heart attack. The people flooded social media with praise, stories about how he'd helped them. I felt sick reading it. All I could picture was him sitting on that bed, patting the space beside him, smiling. I realize now that he probably never needed a dog sitter at all, and that realization still makes my stomach turn. Normally, I don't like calling anyone creepy. I really don't. I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt, especially strangers, because I know how easy it is to misunderstand a situation or read something the wrong way. But I also believe that if someone does something that makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, it's fair to describe that feeling honestly. And even though this encounter might not sound like a huge deal on the surface, it stayed with me in a way I can't fully explain. It unsettled me, and even now I still replay it in my head from time to time. This happened when I was 23. I was running a normal errand, the kind of thing you do without thinking twice about it. I needed groceries, nothing urgent or unusual, just the regular items you pick up during the week. It was the middle of the day, not late at night or during some quiet, empty hour. Everything felt normal, safe, routine. I pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store I usually go to. It's a decent-sized place with a big open lot, rows of parked cars, shopping carts scattered around, and people constantly coming and going. As I was driving through the lot, looking for a place to park, I noticed a white sedan a few spots away. The windows were rolled down, which caught my attention for a moment, but not in a suspicious way. Plenty of people leave their windows down, especially on a nice day. I didn't see anything else strange about it. I parked my car at the other end of the row, turned off the engine, and sat there for a second. Before going inside, I decided to check my phone. I do that a lot, probably more than I should. I wanted to look at a message, maybe scroll a little, just take a moment before heading into the store. I was completely relaxed, minding my own business, not paying attention to anything outside my car. That's when I heard a knock on my window. It startled me so badly that my heart jumped straight into my throat. No one ever knocks on your car window, at least not in my experience. It's not a normal thing that happens, especially in a busy parking lot in the middle of the day. For a split second, I thought maybe I imagined it. Then it happened again. I whipped around in my seat, my phone dropping slightly in my hand, and that's when I saw her. An elderly woman was standing right next to my car, far closer than I would have expected. She knocked on the glass again, then leaned in even closer, putting her face right up to the window, clearly trying to see inside the car. She wasn't just glancing, she was looking directly at me. Something about that made my skin crawl. Knocking on my window alone would have been unsettling, but maybe understandable. Maybe she needed help. Maybe she thought I was someone else. But the way she leaned in, her face so close to the glass, peering inside like that, felt invasive. I felt trapped in that moment, like my personal space had been completely violated, even though I was inside my own car. I froze. My mind started racing, trying to decide what to do. Should I roll down the window and ask her what she needed? Should I crack it just a little? Should I unlock the door? Every option felt wrong. I suddenly became very aware of how vulnerable I was, sitting there with nowhere to go if the situation turned bad. I got a really bad feeling in my gut. It was one of those instinctive reactions that doesn't come with a clear explanation. Nothing obvious was happening, but everything inside me was screaming that I needed to leave, that this situation wasn't right. So I didn't roll down the window. I put my car into gear and drove away. As I pulled out of the parking space and drove down the row, I glanced in my rearview mirror. I saw her walking toward another car, holding what looked like a piece of paper in her hand. She didn't chase after me. She didn't shout. She just moved on to someone else. That's when another detail hit me. The white sedan I had noticed when I first pulled in was now empty. That realization sent another wave of unease through me. It meant she must have gotten out of that car and walked all the way over to where I was parked while I was looking at my phone. I hadn't seen her approach at all. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't noticed any movement. 1 second, I was alone. The next, she was inches away from my window. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I drove around the lot for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I debated whether to park somewhere else and still go inside. I told myself I was probably being dramatic. She was elderly. Maybe she was asking for help. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was just confused. But then my thoughts spiraled into all the worst possibilities. What if she was trying to distract me? What if someone else was involved? What if she came back to my car while I was inside the store? What if she vandalized it or slashed my tires? I knew those thoughts might be extreme, but I couldn't shake them. In the end, I decided not to take the risk. I left the parking lot entirely and drove to a different grocery store, a little farther away. It felt ridiculous even as I did it, but I also felt a strange sense of relief once I was gone, like I had escaped something I didn't fully understand. As I drove, I kept replaying the moment in my head. The knock, her face pressed close to the glass, the way she stared at me. I tried to imagine how it might have felt from her perspective, to see if I was being unfair. But no matter how I looked at it, the way she approached me didn't sit right. After I finished shopping at the other store, I called my mom on the drive home. I told her about what happened, explaining it the way I experienced it. I expected her to understand, or at least see, why I felt uneasy. She didn't. She laughed it off and told me I overreacted. She said the woman was elderly and probably needed help. She said I was silly for driving to another store just because of that. Hearing that made me feel guilty, like maybe I had judged the situation too harshly, like maybe I had been rude or selfish by leaving. For a moment, I started to doubt myself. But then I thought about the feeling I had in that car, that immediate, sharp sense of danger, the way my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I've had similar situations happen in the past, moments where ignoring that feeling would have led to something worse. I've learned, sometimes the hard way, that your instincts exist for a reason, even now. But I don't know if I truly overreacted. Maybe the woman was completely harmless. Maybe she just needed directions or help with something small. Maybe she had no bad intentions at all. But I also know this: I didn't feel safe. And when you don't feel safe, you don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting yourself. The thing that sticks with me most isn't the knock itself. It's how quickly a normal, ordinary moment turned into something uncomfortable. How fast my sense of security disappeared. 1 second I was checking my phone, relaxed and unaware. The next, I felt watched, cornered, exposed. Nothing bad happened in the end. I wasn't followed. I wasn't confronted again. I made it home safely, but that doesn't mean the experience didn't matter. Sometimes it's not about what actually happens. It's about what could have happened, and how close you felt to something going wrong. And even if other people think you're overreacting, even if they tell you you're being dramatic, I still believe it's better to be safe than sorry, because the cost of trusting your instincts is usually small, but the cost of ignoring them can be far greater. Though it might not sound like much to someone hearing it for the first time, for me, it changed the way I look at being alone outside, especially when it starts getting dark. I was 16 at the time, old enough to feel a little independent, but still young enough to be vulnerable in ways I didn't fully understand yet. That day had started out completely normal. I had been at my friend's house after school, just hanging out like we usually did. We talked, laughed, and wasted time the way teenagers do when they don't have any real responsibilities yet. Before I knew it, the sky outside was already starting to change. The bright afternoon light was fading, replaced by that soft, uneasy glow that comes right before night. I didn't think too much of it. I'd walked home plenty of times before, and the route was familiar. To get home, I usually cut through a park. During the day, it's a nice place. Families walk their dogs there, kids play, and people jog or sit on benches. It's open, green, and peaceful. But in the evening, especially when the light starts to disappear, it feels very different. The trees cast long shadows, the paths seem quieter, and every sound feels louder than it should. That evening, the park was mostly empty. There were no kids playing, no groups of people hanging around. Just me, my music, and the sound of my own footsteps on the path. I had my headphones on, listening to music, trying to relax as I walked. I remember thinking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the feeling of heading home after a long day. As I walked further into the park, I noticed an older man riding one of those small scooters along the path. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People use the park for all kinds of things. He was moving slowly, not rushing, just gliding along. I kept my distance and stayed on my side of the footpath. Then I noticed that he stopped. I didn't look directly at him at first. I could feel it more than see it, that sudden pause in movement. Something about it made me uneasy. I glanced over briefly and saw that he was no longer scootering forward. He was just standing there, watching me. That's when my instincts kicked in. I didn't say anything. I didn't look at him for long. I simply moved to the other side of the path, putting as much space between us as I could, without making it obvious that I was scared. I've always been careful around strangers, especially when I'm alone. My parents taught me to trust my gut, and my gut was telling me to be cautious. As soon as I moved away from him, he started talking. I couldn't hear him clearly at first because my headphones were still on and the music was playing. His voice came through in broken pieces, mixed with the music in my ears. I remember pulling one earphone slightly away, just enough to hear him better without fully stopping. That's when I caught a few words that made my stomach drop. I'm still not completely sure what he said, but I clearly remember hearing something about murderers in the park, and then something like, "Don't worry, I'll take care of them for you." I remember thinking, what the hell? My heart started racing. That wasn't something a normal stranger says to a teenage girl walking alone in a park. Even if he meant it as a joke, even if he thought he was being reassuring in some strange way, it came across as deeply unsettling. The tone of his voice, the timing, the fact that he had stopped just to talk to me, it all felt wrong. I didn't respond to him. I didn't ask him to repeat himself. I didn't engage at all. I just walked faster. I kept my head down and focused on moving away from him as quickly as I could without running. I didn't want to provoke him or draw attention. I could feel my hands starting to shake and my chest felt tight. Every few steps I fought the urge to turn around and check if he was following me. The path felt longer than it ever had before. The exit of the park seemed far away, like it was moving instead of me. My thoughts were all over the place. What did he mean by that? Was he trying to scare me? Was he confused? Was he dangerous? I tried to remind myself that he was older and on a scooter, and that maybe he was just strange or lonely, but the fear wouldn't go away. It sat heavy in my stomach, telling me that I needed to get out of there. I keep replaying this moment in my head over and over, trying to understand what was really happening and whether I escaped something terrible without even realizing how close I was to danger. It's been consuming my thoughts since it happened, and no matter how many times I go through it, nothing about it feels normal or harmless. This happened just yesterday. I was doing something I do all the time, something that has always made me feel calm and grounded. I was walking at my local park. I go there 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more. It's part of my routine, a place where I clear my head, listen to music, and get some fresh air. I've had a few uncomfortable moments there before, like strange looks or people standing too close, but nothing even remotely like this. The park is laid out in a way that splits it into 2 main walking tracks. One side loops around open areas where people can see you easily, and the other side curves around soccer fields, with a hill on one side and a stretch of woods on the other. That backside has always made me a little uneasy. If you're back there alone, you're basically hidden. From the parking lot and most of the park, no one can see you clearly. I've always been aware of that, and because of it, I'm extra careful whenever I walk that section. That morning it was around 10:45. The weather was nice, sunny, and about 65 degrees. It felt like a safe time to be out. There were people around the park, kids at the fields, cars coming and going. Nothing about the day felt threatening. I parked my car and started walking down toward the backside of the track. As I was heading that way, I noticed a man walking ahead of me, maybe 500 feet in front. I didn't think much of it at first. It's a walking track after all. People come and go constantly. The only thing that stood out was how he was dressed. He was wearing all black, a black hoodie pulled up, black jeans, dark shoes. On a cool day, that wouldn't have been strange, but on a sunny morning like this, it caught my attention. Still, I didn't dwell on it. People wear what they want. I kept walking. As I went down the hill toward the curve in the track, I lost sight of him for just a moment. The track bends in a way where you can't see straight ahead for a few seconds. When I rounded that corner, I expected to see him further along, maybe nearing the path that leads back up toward the parking lot. He was gone. That's when something inside me tightened. There was no way he could have walked fast enough to completely disappear in the few seconds it took me to round the curve. The area isn't that big. I slowed my pace and started scanning my surroundings. First, I looked to my left, up the hill toward the soccer fields. If he had turned that way, I would have seen him climbing up or already at the top. There was nothing, no movement, no black hoodie, no one. Then I looked to my right. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the woods, partially hidden behind a tree. Not deep in the forest, but close enough that the shadows swallowed most of his body. He was about 10 feet away from me, close enough that I could clearly see the shape of him, close enough that I knew, without a doubt, he was watching me. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. I didn't hesitate. I didn't question myself. I turned around and ran. Every instinct in my body took over. I didn't scream. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could back up the track toward the more open area. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts. All I could think was that I needed to get somewhere visible. As I ran, I pulled out my phone and called my boyfriend. He was working nearby, not far from the park. I didn't even know what I was going to say. I just needed someone to hear me, to know where I was in case something happened. I ran until my legs burned. The only person I saw was an older man walking in the opposite direction. I slowed just long enough to tell him what had happened, that there was a man hiding in the woods back there. He looked at me like I was crazy and laughed it off. That reaction hurt more than I expected. It made me feel foolish and alone, even though my fear was still screaming at me. I turned around to point out where I had seen the man. He was there, about 400 feet behind me, walking on the track like nothing had happened. That sight sent another surge of fear through me. I didn't stop. I didn't argue. When I was very young, around 4 years old, my dad worked as a mechanic. One day, while he was at work, he found a tiny, ugly-looking chihuahua wandering around a junkyard. The dog was dirty, skinny, and honestly didn't look like it would survive very long on its own. Something about it must have tugged at my dad's heart, because instead of leaving it there, he brought it home with him. My parents didn't plan to keep the dog. Their intention was to take it to a shelter as soon as possible. When they brought it inside and told me what they were going to do, I completely broke down. I begged and pleaded in every way a small child knows how. I promised I would take care of it myself. I swore I would feed it, watch it, and make sure nothing bad happened to it. At that time, we lived in the middle of nowhere, out on the wide open plains of the Texas Panhandle. There were no close neighbors, no busy streets, just land stretching in every direction. I think my parents agreed partly because they didn't believe the dog would last long anyway. They probably assumed nature would take its course, but that didn't happen. The little Chihuahua survived. Not only that, it grew. Over the years, it kept getting bigger and stronger in a way that surprised everyone. By the time 5 years had passed, that small, fragile-looking dog had turned into a large, powerful, beautiful animal. We named him Ernie after Sesame Street. He wasn't just a pet. He followed me everywhere. Wherever I went, Ernie went too. He slept near my room, waited outside when I played, and walked with me whenever I left the house. He was loyal in a way that felt almost human. By the time I was around 9 years old, my parents trusted me enough to let me drive a golf cart by myself. My grandparents lived about 2 miles away, and after school, I would sometimes take the golf cart across the fields to visit them. The path wasn't a proper road. It was mostly open land with a few fences and ditches cutting through it. I'd made that trip many times before, and Ernie always followed alongside me, keeping pace as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One afternoon, while heading to my grandparents' house, the golf cart suddenly slowed and stopped. The battery had completely died about halfway through the trip. I sat there for a moment, annoyed but not scared. This kind of thing happens sometimes. I got out of the cart, and Ernie was right there, waiting like he always did. Since there was no choice, I started walking the rest of the way. We hadn't gone far when everything changed. Out of nowhere, Ernie stopped walking. He turned toward me and began to growl. It wasn't a playful sound or a warning bark. This was deep, serious, and aggressive. I froze. This dog was massive compared to me, and I had never seen him behave like this before. My heart started pounding instantly. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Just a few days earlier, I had watched Old Yeller. That movie was still fresh in my mind, and fear took over. I convinced myself that Ernie must have rabies, that he had suddenly turned dangerous. I panicked. Without thinking clearly, I tried to run past him. I barely took 2 steps. Ernie lunged at me and knocked me to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I screamed, expecting pain, expecting teeth, expecting the worst. But it never came. Instead, Ernie stood over me, his body tense, blocking my path forward. He wasn't attacking me. He wasn't biting. He wasn't even growling at me anymore. He was growling at something else, something I couldn't see. After a moment, he stepped off me. I didn't wait to understand what was happening. I jumped up and ran as fast as I could back toward our house. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I was crying, terrified, convinced that something horrible had just happened or was about to happen. When I finally reached home, I burst inside and told my dad everything through tears. My dad's face changed immediately. He grabbed his gun and headed outside. I was hysterical at that point. I thought he was going to kill Ernie. The idea of losing him on top of everything else was unbearable. I begged and cried, but my dad didn't say much. He just told me to stay inside. An hour passed. It felt like forever. Then I heard a gunshot. My heart dropped. A short time later, my dad came back, with Ernie walking calmly beside him, completely unharmed. I was shocked. I ran to Ernie and hugged him, crying even harder now, but this time from relief. My dad explained what had really happened. Ahead of where the golf cart had died, hidden in a ditch I always drove past without noticing, was a large nest of rattlesnakes. Not just one or two, many of them. Coiled, camouflaged, and deadly. According to my dad, there was no way I could have missed them if I had walked any farther. Ernie must have heard them or sensed them before I ever... I didn't think much of it at first. That's probably the most honest way to begin this story. At the time, it felt like just another stop on a long drive, the kind of pause you barely remember once the trip is over. But now, years later, this moment still comes back to me in quiet flashes, especially when I'm driving alone at night. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, nothing truly awful happened, and yet it left a mark. I was on a long road trip by myself, driving across several states. I don't even remember exactly why I was traveling anymore. It could have been for work, or to visit someone, or maybe just to get away for a while. What I do remember clearly is the feeling of being alone on the road for hours, the kind of alone where the world outside your windshield feels endless and empty, and your thoughts start looping in strange ways. I had been driving since earlier that day. The sun had gone down a while ago, and by the time this happened, it was around 10 at night. Not the middle of the night, but late enough that the roads were quieter and rest stops felt more isolated. My eyes were starting to feel heavy, not from exhaustion exactly, but from staring at the same dark stretch of road for too long. The radio faded in and out as I passed through different areas, and eventually I turned it off completely. Silence felt easier. I wasn't desperate for gas yet, but I knew I'd need to stop soon. I also needed a break. My legs were stiff, my shoulders tense from gripping the steering wheel for so long. When I saw a gas station sign ahead, I felt relieved. It wasn't one of those huge, busy stations with restaurants and bright signs everywhere. It was small, simple, sitting just off the highway like an afterthought. As I pulled off the road and into the station, I noticed how quiet it was. The lights above the pumps were bright and harsh, creating a sharp contrast with the darkness beyond them. Everything outside that circle of light disappeared into blackness. There were no nearby buildings, no houses, no other businesses. Just the road behind me and the road ahead. There was only one other car there. It was a plain sedan, nothing flashy or damaged. Just clean, simple, and forgettable. It pulled up to the pump across from mine at almost the same time I arrived. I remember noticing that its windows were clean and the car looked well taken care of. That detail stuck with me later, even though at the time it didn't feel important. I parked at my pump, turned off the engine, and sat there for a second, gathering myself. I always take a moment before getting out of the car, especially at night. I like to look around, get a sense of the place. Everything seemed normal enough, quiet, but not obviously threatening. I stepped out and went inside to pay. The convenience store was small, with narrow aisles and shelves packed with snacks and drinks. The lights buzzed softly overhead. The cashier looked bored and tired, like they had seen too many nights just like this one. I paid for the gas, grabbed a bottle of water, and headed back outside. That's when everything shifted. The man from the other car was no longer sitting in his vehicle. He was standing right next to my driver's side door. For a split second, my brain didn't understand what I was seeing. I slowed down, my steps faltering. My heart jumped in my chest, and my stomach tightened in a way that felt automatic, like my body reacted before my mind could catch up. He wasn't leaning against my car or touching it. He was just standing there, close enough that there was no mistaking who he was waiting for. Me. He looked ordinary. That's what made it worse in a strange way. He didn't look angry. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look dirty or unstable. He was dressed neatly, standing calmly, like this was the most natural place in the world for him to be. Before I could say anything, he spoke. "Long drive, huh?" His voice was relaxed, almost friendly, the kind of tone you might hear from someone making small talk in a checkout line. I nodded, unsure what else to do. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to encourage the conversation. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You take the I-90? That alone might not have been alarming. Plenty of people use the same highways, but he didn't stop there. "That stretch after the river is real dark," he continued. "No lights at all. You should be careful." He described the exact route I had been taking. Not just the highway number, but a specific part of it. A part I remembered clearly, because it had felt especially empty and unsettling earlier in the drive. I hadn't told him where I was going. I hadn't said anything about my route. I hadn't been on the phone. I hadn't mentioned my plans to anyone in that gas station. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe he was guessing. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe he had just driven that same road and was warning me out of kindness. But none of those explanations felt right. I managed to mutter a quiet thanks, barely audible even to myself. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't question him. I didn't want to give him any reason to keep talking. I unlocked my car, got inside, and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I did it. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, loud and fast. He didn't step back. He just stood there, watching me through the window. I started the engine, forcing myself to move slowly, normally. I didn't want to look panicked. I didn't want to draw attention. As I pulled away from the pump, I glanced at him through the side mirror. He was still standing there, his head turning slightly to follow my car as I drove past. The second I merged back onto the highway, my chest felt tight. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see his headlights appear behind me. They didn't. The road behind me stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something wasn't over just because I had left the station. The words he said kept repeating in my head, the way he described the road, the certainty in his voice, the fact that he had positioned himself by my door instead of staying near his own car. I drove for a few minutes, my thoughts spiraling. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that nothing had actually happened, that people talked to strangers all the time at gas stations. But my instincts were screaming at me. When I saw the next exit sign, I didn't hesitate. I took it immediately, even though it wasn't part of my planned route. I didn't care where it led. I just knew I didn't want to stay on that stretch of road any longer. The new route had more lights, more signs of life. Even just seeing another car in the distance made me feel a little calmer. It took a while, but eventually my breathing slowed, and the shaking in my hands stopped. I made it to where I was going without any more incidents. No one followed me. No one confronted me again. If you told this story in a few sentences, it might not sound like much. A man made a comment. I felt uncomfortable. I left. But the fear I felt in that moment was real. What scared me wasn't just what he said. It was how easily he inserted himself into my space, how confidently he stood by my door, how much he seemed to know without me saying a word. To this day, I still don't know how he knew my route. Maybe he saw my license plate and made an educated guess. Maybe he overheard me talking earlier without me realizing it. Maybe it really was just coincidence. But I've learned that sometimes it doesn't matter if you can explain something logically after the fact. What matters is how it feels in the moment. That night taught me to trust my instincts, especially on the road, to pay attention to small details, to leave situations that feel wrong even if I can't fully explain why. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones where something terrible happens. They're the ones where nothing happens, and you're left wondering how close you came to something much worse.